French cuisine and white nationalism, the false master narrative. As America entered the industrial age, worsening racism and Jim Crow policies, as well as a colonialist, imperialist, white nationalist mindset permeating the United States and Europe, spawned new fashion preferences for European cuisine. However, fad and fashion be damned, as President and Mrs. Benjamin Harrison had no intention of giving up the culinary delicacies afforded them by way of Miss Dolly Johnson. Originally from Kentucky, Miss Johnson had been Harrison's cook in Indianapolis and was urgently called to the White House sometime around 1890 to replace the French chef, Madame Petronard. Apparently, the president preferred Miss Johnson's dishes because, according to a contemporary observer, Dolly Johnson is an artist. With a Virginia girl named Mary to help her, continues the observer, she can produce a state dinner with as succulent meats and as delicate pastries as the liked patrons of Delmonico. French cooking did not interest President Grover Cleveland either. One look at Cleveland and you knew he loved food and was serious about it. Eating was at least one of his pleasures, and he did not waste it on French fare. Henry F. Graff, in his biography on Cleveland, writes, the meals prepared for him were elaborate, although unless he was entertaining guests, no wine was served. He did not enjoy the offerings of the French chef he had inherited from the urbane Chester Arthur. Grover Cleveland, who served two non-consecutive terms in the White House and who occupied the White House in 1896 when the Supreme Court handed down its decision on Plessy versus Ferguson, wrote to his old law partner and inseparable companion, Wilson Shannon Bissell. I must go to dinner, but I wish it was to eat pickled herring, Swiss cheese, and a chop at Lewis's instead of the French stuff I shall find. Graff goes on to relate that on one occasion, when Cleveland's dinner was about to be served, he noticed the enticing and appetizing aroma of corned beef and cabbage coming from the servant quarters. Cleveland told his African personal aide, William Sinclair, to the dismay of the chef, well, William, take this dinner down to the servants and bring their dinner to me. Cleveland declared it the best food he had had for months. The French chef, Alfred Kuplinger, was finally fired, and in his place was installed Cleveland's longtime cook Eliza from Albany, who cooked for Cleveland when he was governor of New York. It was during this era that legislators and the courts led numerous actions to foster segregation and reestablish the precept of African inferiority by reincarnating slavery jurisprudence. Slavery jurisprudence is laws created and enforced and court decisions handed down during the era of slavery. The betrayal of Africans through the demise of Reconstruction saw the reinstitution of racial patterns, laws, and court decisions almost identical to those during the era of slavery. One of the actions taken was the enactment of an 1890 statute requiring segregation on railroads. Pursuant to this statute, and on the heels of the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision, Homer A. Plessy versus Ferguson, the early 20th century witnessed a planet-wide proliferation of laws, legislation, and ordinances setting up residential and other types of segregation in cities designed to uphold racial hierarchies. Clearly, the goal of these municipal segregation ordinances, thus similar to Plessy, was not simply to separate the races to ensure social cohesion, but rather to brand African Americans with the mark of inferiority through the arm of the law. It was part and parcel of a growing white nationalism that was taking off as France was catapulting itself into the ranks of culinary supremacy at the end of the 19th and turn of the 20th centuries, resulting from joint efforts with its fellow Europeans in carving up and colonizing the African continent, and the rest of the non-white world. Its thrusts of imperialism and colonialism into countries in Southeast Asia in the mid 1800s and Africa in the mid 1880s through 1914 coincided with and reinforced France's push for dominance in the culinary field. Such imperialism and colonialism fostered European control over Southeast Asia's and Africa's mineral and agricultural wealth, which then provided vast monetary support for the building of luxury hotels, such as the Savoy, opened in 1889, the Ritz, opened in 1898, and the Carlton, opened in 1899. The opening of many more new hotels all over Europe, as well as in Cairo and Johannesburg, was commissioned. These hotels were the meeting places, the recognized rendezvous for kings and emperors, politicians, stars of the stage, the idle rich, sugar and steel magnates, diamond mining millionaires, and bankers from France and many other countries. For high society patrons of these hotels, money was no object, and they needed somewhere to show off their African diamonds and to spend the riches they were blood sucking out of the African colonies. And these establishments offered the highest levels of comfort, superb service, and royal dining. The same luxury hotels commissioned French chef Auguste Escoffier to set up and sometimes manage its dining rooms. Once it was agreed that these were the grand hotels, the dining rooms, installed with French chefs, were considered purveyors of the grand cuisine. And note that a number of the food supplies for the grand cuisine came from colonized African and Southeast Asian countries. Wherever Escoffier was called in to personally take charge of setting up kitchen and dining rooms, especially at the various Carlton hotels then springing up, he himself claimed that his recipes helped to enhance the restaurant's reputation as a new temple of gastronomy. Of course, it was all hype and propaganda. French cooks abroad were considered traveling salesmen, agents of promotion of the propaganda, of the idea that anything French and culinary was superior to everyone else. In this way, food was used to promote and advance France's social and political station and identity. The potential of food as a powerful ambassador of the French brand and of white supremacy was accomplished. With an unbridled Eurocentric arrogance, Auguste Escoffier states, French chefs are superior to those from other countries. One only needs to understand that the French soil has the privilege to naturally and abundantly produce the best vegetables, the best fruits, and the best wines that exist in the world. France also has the best poultry, the most tender meat, and the most varied and delicate kinds of game. France's shores yield the finest kinds of fish and shellfish. It is therefore only natural that Frenchmen have become both gourmets and fine chefs. Escoffier continues, but for a population to enjoy fine cuisine, it is also important that they should have had a long heritage of a courteous style of living that stresses the importance of a good meal celebrated among friends, and that there should be a strong domestic tradition whereby all the secrets of fine cooking are transmitted from mother to daughter. In the reputation of our French cuisine, I see proof of our degree of civilization. With regard to France's long heritage of a courteous style of living and degree of civilization, which has allowed production of fine cooking, we have already had a look at this heritage in my At the Table of Power, Food and Cuisine and the African American Struggle for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. In light of Escoffier's statements, it is crucial that we take a serious look at this degree of civilization as it applies to the cultural and culinary legacy and reputation of France and Europe in general. Old European cookbooks tell us what was possible, but do not reveal the reality of everyday meals. We can look at 15th century Europe, that fateful era when Columbus was about to decimate the lives of indigenous peoples in what is now the Americas. Europe was, for most of its people, a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. Because of the abysmal social conditions and prevailing social values, it was a place filled with malice and hatred, its only unifying bond being the occasional episode of mass hysteria. Street crime lurked around every corner in most cities of Europe. Epidemic outbreaks of plague and smallpox, and attacks of measles, influenza, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, and other diseases cleaned out 10 to 20% of the populations of European cities and towns in a single incident. Famine was common and had been for centuries, and in times of famine, cities and towns became the settings for food riots. In the 16th century, throughout Europe, for generations, it was said that the rich ate and ate to excess. The rest of the population starved. And this was in normal times. It was noted in 1594 that Parisians were reduced to eating rats and other vermin. In the 17th century, when times were getting better, the slightest rise in food prices would cause the deaths of additional tens of thousands who already lived on the brink of hunger and starvation. Any increase in the price of wheat or millet killed a proportion of the French population equal to nearly twice the percentage of Americans who died in the Civil War. Disease and famine caused many deaths and were so common throughout Europe that it has been an ongoing debate as to the actual number of people who died of disease compared to those who starved to death. Throughout these earlier centuries, France knew every aspect of poverty, and across all of France, between one-third and half of the population fell into some category of destitution, and in regions such as Brittany, Western Normandy, Poitou, and the Massif, the percentage was upwards to two-thirds. In rural areas, in general, between half and 90% of the population did not have land sufficient for their upkeep, forcing them to migrate, fall into permanent debt, or die. In Périgord, France, apocalyptic best described the environment. It was said that here people are dying like flies. Périgord was poor in consumption of bread, which, along with chestnuts, was the primary diet of many parts of France. Dairy products were rare and therefore one of the reasons for general malnutrition. But France was not unique. In Genoa, Italy, the homeless poor sold themselves as galley slaves every winter. In some northern Italian areas, during winter months, the indigent simply froze to death. During summer months, Rome, along with other towns, was a graveyard of fever. Peasants everywhere lived in a state of uncertainty and economic dependence. Diets were monotonous, the consumption of cereals and dry vegetables, basically depending on the season and the occasion. Bread soaked in broth, rubbed with a little garlic and oil, defined the morning, midday, as well as the evening supper. To these soups were sometimes added a little meat or bacon. Dairy products that were consumed could easily cause disease. Eating in those days meant taking a risk. For other than the well-to-do, food intake was always unbalanced and living uncertain from one day to the next. This situation did not change from the 16th to the 17th century. Roadside ditches filled with stagnant water served as public latrines in the European cities of the 15th century, and they would do so for centuries to follow. Decomposing butchered animals were left lying in the streets. Large open pits served the dead bodies of the poor, laid side by side, row upon row. When the pit was filled, it was finally covered with earth. The stench from these corpse-filled pits covered large areas of the cities. Unfortunately, visitors to a European city during this era would be repelled by the appearance and stench of the living as well. Most people never bathed, not once in an entire lifetime. Almost all Europeans had a brush with smallpox and other deforming diseases that left survivors partially blinded, pockmarked, or crippled, while it was the norm for individuals to have bad breath from rotting teeth and constant stomach disorders. Ulcers, eczema, scabs, running sores, and other skin diseases were extremely common and often lasted for years. For most people in France, all of the daily activities, cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes working, took place in a bare-walled single room, which housed entire families. And within this single room, the kitchen utensils rolled around and mingled with the chamber pots, which would explain some of the illnesses and diseases that were prevalent. Crowding was the general rule. No more than one Parisian household in 10 knew what it was like to have a real bedroom. Kitchens devoted solely to the preparation of food were as few at the end of the 18th century as at the beginning. Still, dominating the townspeople's diet was bread, which was their main sustenance. New products, such as inferior cuts of meat, could be acquired by the lower classes. However, there was one lively food market in the city to which the lower classes turned. By making purchases in second-hand food from dealers who redistributed leftovers of meals bought from servants who worked in households of the nobles and the bourgeoisie, poor people took a step toward a new type of consumption. Such severe culinary deprivations make it easy to see why the traditional portions of a French entree are so small. As mentioned at the table of power, these portions are based on and represent the scarcity of food and the poverty of culinary resources endemic in France during these eras. French culinary technique and presentation is lauded and applauded over actual taste. One last note on the degree of civilization of France and Europe in general. Throughout Europe, about half of the children born during this time died before reaching 10 years of age. Among the poor classes, the percentage was higher. I should add that close to 3 out of 10 babies in Spain did not live to see their first birthdays. In addition to exposure, disease, and malnutrition, one of the causes for such a high infant mortality rate was abandonment. Thousands upon thousands of children who could not be cared for were simply left to die on dung heaps or in roadside ditches. Others were sold into slavery. By the 18th and 19th centuries, these practices had become so epidemic that foundling hospitals were created in European cities, but they simply became dumping grounds for hundreds of thousands of infants, from which few children ever emerged alive. The American culinary master narrative tells us that European cuisine is the foundation of American cuisine. Well, if the master narrative is not a lie, if, as it says, France produces the best of everything, it would not have looked for economic salvation by way of the slave trade, nor in later eras colonize and impose its imperialistic control over Africa and Southeast Asia, draining both of them of their fruits, vegetables, meats, seafood, rice, paper products, and let us not forget labor. After all, the wealth of any country was always defined by its agricultural production and the ability to feed its people. The European invasion of Africa, the Americas, Indonesia, India, and Asia was predicated on the lust and greed for gold and other minerals, as well as on finding an answer to Europe's problems in agriculture and food production. Therefore, it would be correct to state that whatever France produces now of value is only the result of what it has stolen from Africa and other non-European cultures. Escoffier, however, would have you believe otherwise. According to him, peaches, frog dishes, crushed tomatoes, and tomato sauce and other food products became popular only due to him and France. On the Carlton Hotel's menu, he placed what he called peach melba, which is a hot peeled peach cut in half, placed on top of some vanilla ice cream, and garnished with pureed raspberries. Escoffier writes in his typical silly arrogance that 27 years after the dessert appeared, it still has worldwide renown. And, says he, any variation on this recipe ruins the delicate balance of its taste. Now, Black American cooks throughout the 1800s and beyond served fruit such as peaches with ice cream all of the time. It was a very common thing. How could anyone fall for this as something new? The same rubbish has been said of consuming frog legs. According to one writer, Africans in slavery knew frogs only as useful in magic. It was the French, writes Kenneth James, who spread the idea of frog eating throughout their colonies and following their influence in isolated places, even in North America. Frogs, however, were prevalent in the Americas, in the US and Caribbean islands, such as Saint Domingue, Haiti, and Martinique, both of which became slave territories under the French. Indigenous peoples, as well as the Africans brought to the Americas in chains, were well versed in stewing frog legs. Also, let us not forget that Europeans feared tomatoes down through the 19th century. Escoffier desperately needed a few good culinary history lessons, although I do not think they would have made any difference since he was one of the architects of the dishonest master narrative. There seems to be no place in Escoffier's or certain other European dialogue that considers or acknowledges the consumption of these and other food products grown, prepared, and consumed by non-whites since time immemorial. Let Escoffier and others tell it. France invented food. It was not just Africa's foods that were under siege to benefit and provide the luxury hotel dining room with a culinary reputation. Escoffier played a role in servicing the culinary appetites of those who serviced England's monetary and economic appetites in South Africa. In 1899, the Carlton Hotel opened at just about the same time as the start of the Second Boer War. The English and the Dutch, deep into imperialistic activities in Africa, fought over South Africa's gold and diamonds, minerals that belonged to neither European country. Escoffier reminisces about dining at the Carlton at the beginning of the Second Boer War. Every evening, several tables were sure to be reserved in the main restaurant for farewell dinners for officers leaving for the Transvaal. These very pleasant dinners, rendered full of gaiety by the officers' enthusiasm, were just a foretaste of the brilliant future to come for the Carlton. At the dinner hour, one could see there the richest people in England and the world, and it was not rare on some nights to see our charming lady customers bedecked in jewels worth millions, sparkling in the subdued lighting, which had been carefully studied to enhance their complexions with a soft pink. Those were the good old days, unquote. Well, suffice to say, France has been able to convince America and the world to buy what France has been selling, that the French damn near invented food, that only the French are experts in cuisine, and that French cuisine is not only a science, but an art. In fact, according to one of France's famous chefs, France was, and all others claim it still is, quote, the motherland of anyone who entertains guests. Its cuisine and wines are the triumph of gastronomy, and it is the only country for good food. Now, writers on the subject refer to France's articulation of a self-imposed and self-anointed superiority as culinary nationalism and gastro-nationalism. I refer to it as another form of white nationalism because it uses food as as a totally exclusionary vehicle of national identity. Exclusionary because it registers France as having origin labels on numerous foods and dishes that do not belong to them, while prohibiting others from making similar food claims materially or symbolically. Well, as long as the nationalism is white and superiority or supremacy refers to white dominance, the French version is perfectly acceptable. And once America accepts you as great, as America goes, so goes the world. Thank you.